Welcome to Nazir Fears.
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The night had always felt heavier in the town of Raven Hollow, but tonight it pressed on Daniel Turner's chest with a weight that made each breath a conscious effort. He had stayed late at the archives again, the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights above, mixing with the distant howl of the wind outside. Daniel thought he was alone, but somewhere in the darkness, he knew he wasn't. The first sound that made his heart jump was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. But there was a rhythm to it, a soft, deliberate step that seemed to echo his own. Daniel paused, eyes straining through the shadows, but the hallway was empty, silent except for the whisper of wind rattling the broken window panes. He told himself it was a cat, the drafts of the building, nothing more. Yet the steps continued, following, patient, as if waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves fully known. Each time Daniel moved, the steps mirrored him, ever so slightly behind, a shadow of sound, a ghost of presence that sent shivers crawling up his spine. Panic began to settle in, a cold, unrelenting fear that knotted his stomach and made his hands tremble. He moved faster, but the steps kept pace, soft and inexorable, always one beat behind, sometimes quickening when his own pulse raced. Daniel's rational mind searched for explanations, but the logic refused to comfort him as the darkness seemed to pulse around him, alive, breathing, watching. He reached the stairs, and the air grew colder, thickening with a pressure that pressed down on his shoulders, making him stagger slightly as though the building itself leaned in to watch. Each step downward echoed unnaturally, and then he heard it, a whisper, so faint that he almost convinced himself it wasn't real. Daniel. The voice carried a weight, patient, knowing, a sound that promised he was being observed. He froze, every muscle taut, forcing himself to move. By the time he reached the lobby, he was sweating despite the chill, hands shaking as he turned the doorknob. But even outside, the streets seemed wrong. The darkness beyond the lamplights felt thicker, oppressive, as though the air itself was alive. Daniel's own shadow stretched unnaturally long in the flickering light, and somewhere behind him, he could feel a presence, faceless, silent, waiting. He didn't look back. At home, the warmth of the small apartment did little to soothe his nerves. Daniel kept the lights on, though they flickered ominously, casting angles and shapes that didn't make sense. Every corner seemed too dark, every reflection too deliberate, and when he slept, he dreamed of footsteps circling his bed, each one precise, echoing, closing in from impossible angles. He woke in the night, drenched in sweat, sure that something was standing at the foot of his bed, faceless, watching, measuring. Over the next days, Daniel tried to maintain a semblance of normal life, work, errands, conversations, but the feeling never left. He noticed things others wouldn't, doors slightly ajar that he was certain he had closed, shadows that didn't belong, the faint echo of steps in rooms he'd just left. The night watcher, he began to call it in his mind, though he had no proof, no tangible evidence, only a growing certainty that he was being hunted. Friends brushed off his fear, attributing it to stress, long nights, and overactive imagination. But Daniel knew better. Each night the steps returned, patient, measured, always one beat behind, a predator waiting for the prey to falter. Driven by desperation, Daniel researched obsessively, delving into old town records, newspapers, and local legends. The stories were consistent. People who felt watched, pursued, haunted by something invisible yet suffocating. Each account ended the same way: disappearance, collapse, or madness. One journal from decades ago mentioned the Night Watcher, a being that waited for recognition, for acknowledgement, and once noticed, it would never leave. Daniel's own experience aligned too closely with the accounts. Every time he consciously noted the steps behind him, every glance over his shoulder, he felt its power grow. Sleep became impossible. Food and water lost meaning. The Watcher was patient, infinite in persistence, and now it was feeding on his fear. One evening, Daniel decided to confront it. He left his apartment, flashlight in hand, walking down the familiar streets that had once felt safe, but now felt alien, alive with menace. The steps began immediately, soft, deliberate, echoing in perfect harmony with his own heartbeat. He resisted looking back, telling himself he would not give it acknowledgement, but the presence pressed in on him, surrounding him, invisible yet impossible to ignore. The air grew colder, heavier, his breath visible in quick puffs. Then he felt it, the pressure of someone standing just behind, a weight against his spine that made movement laborious. He glanced briefly over his shoulder, a decision that froze his blood. In the flickering light, he glimpsed the faceless silhouette, impossibly tall, stretching beyond the bounds of logic, faceless but present, a void made flesh and shadow. It advanced slowly, each step measured, echoing in time with the invisible rhythm that had haunted him for days. Daniel stumbled, flashlight clattering to the ground, the beam bouncing across the walls to reveal nothing. And yet, everything. He ran blindly, heart hammering, legs screaming, down alleyways, across streets, into parks. But the steps were always there, never faltering, always just behind. The whisper returned, this time louder, a voice not meant to soothe, but to terrify. Why do you run? He returned home, barricading doors, turning every light on. Yet the feeling persisted. Shadows gathered unnaturally in corners, stretching across the floor, across walls, bending toward him. The Watcher was patient. It did not need to attack in a single moment. It was eternal, stalking, waiting. Daniel's reflection in the mirror sometimes showed movement behind him that did not exist. The faint outline of something faceless, humanoid, but impossible, bending space in ways that made his mind reel. Sleep eluded him. Days merged into nights. He stopped eating, stopped talking, barely moved, every step haunted by the memory of unseen feet echoing behind him. Attempts to leave the town failed. Roads seemed longer, streets rearranged themselves, shadows deepened. The Watcher existed outside time and space, and Daniel's awareness was its sustenance. Weeks turned into months. Daniel's body weakened, his mind frayed, yet the presence never faltered. He became obsessed with rituals, with charms, anything that might give him control, but nothing worked. He tried to sleep, tried to hide, tried to ignore it, but each movement, each heartbeat, each conscious thought drew it closer. The footsteps would start at night, soft and precise, growing louder if he panicked, growing insistent if he glanced back. One night, he heard them even in his apartment, echoing through walls, through closed doors, through the very air. The Watcher was patient, infinite, unavoidable. Daniel realized the horrifying truth. It required acknowledgement, and by knowing it was there, he gave it strength. It needed no door, no window, no physical space. It existed in perception, in fear, in the act of being noticed. Finally, Daniel understood that the only way to survive was to forget, to deny, to refuse awareness. But he could not. The fear had embedded itself into his very being. Every night, every moment of quiet, he could hear the faint, deliberate rhythm of steps following him, pressing against his spine, circling his mind, patient, faceless, eternal. The night watcher had claimed him not through violence, but through awareness, through the subtle horror of knowing, through the inescapable truth that some entities exist beyond our understanding, waiting for recognition. Daniel Turner became a ghost in life, a shadow in his own apartment, walking among streets and alleys, each step a reminder that acknowledgement was death, that fear fed the eternal observer, and that the watcher would always be behind him, waiting for the next blink, the next breath, the next fleeting glance that would seal the fate of another who dared to notice. And somewhere, in the quiet streets of Raven Hollow, the steps continued, soft, deliberate, patient, echoing in the night, waiting for the next soul to hear them and look back.